Welcome to the Wanderers History Podcast, and to a new episode of the miniseries looking at the history of some of the most important doges of 16th century Venetian history, part of the wider Rulers and Monarchs of the 16th century Mediterranean and Europe series. In the last episode, I talked about Doge Leonardo Loredan and his leadership during the War of the League of Cambrai, a pivotal moment in the history of Venice and the Italian peninsula. Today, I want to talk about Andrea Gritti, another crucial figure of 16th century Venetian history, the Fabius Maximus of Venice as described by historian Robert Findlay. Before we continue, I would like to remind you to please hit that subscribe button to make sure you never miss any new material from the podcast. Let us resume. Andrea Gritti was born in 1455 near Verona. His mother was the daughter of Paolo Zane, an influential Venetian family in economic and naval military affairs. His grandfather was a Venetian diplomat often sent on missions to England, Spain, and France, and acted as a mentor for Andrea, who would study at the University of Padova. Later on, he would move to Constantinople and have several profitable enterprises and businesses in the Galata district. He became well acquainted with viziers, grand viziers, and even Sultan Bayezid II. In 1492, circumstances made that Gritti assumed the role, though not officially confirmed, of Venetian bailo in Constantinople, arguably one of the most important diplomatic roles for any Venetian official during the early modern period. The Second Ottoman-Venetian War started in 1499 and put Andrea Gritti in a fairly precarious position and would, along with other Venetian merchants, be imprisoned. In late 1502, early 1503, he was actively involved in the peace talks between the defeated Venetians and the Ottomans. In December of 1503, he returned to Venice and presented his report case, all of the documents, to the Venetian Senate, rapidly becoming an important military and diplomatic figure. His progression was quite rapid and he was appointed Proveditore Generale, afterwards a member of the Council of Ten, and then he became a procurator of St. Mark, one of the most powerful and prestigious positions of the Venetian Republic. As spoken about in the previous episode, the War of the League of Cambrai initially could have proven to be the end of the Venetian Republic, especially after the Battle of Agnadello, had diplomacy tactics and shifting alliances not worked in Venice's favor. At the calamitous defeat at Agnadello, Condottiero Bartolomeo d'Alviano ended up captured by French forces. Gritti managed to escape to Brescia. Eventually, Andrea Gritti was part of the diplomatic team negotiating with the French, which resulted in the eventual victory of the Franco-Venetian alliance and the restoration of most of Venice's terraferma, that being the Venetian Italian mainland. So thus far, Andrea Gritti gained substantial knowledge of Ottoman-Venetian relations. He knew about the economic importance of peace for the Venetians, but also he knew about the inner workings of the Venetian European diplomacy and overall republicanism. The experience gained through the War of the League of Cambrai equipped him for the role he would eventually assume as Doge of Venice and for the challenges facing the Venetian Republic in the 1520s and the 1530s. The early 1520s were quite important in terms of changes in leadership, especially in Rome and in Venice. After the death of Doge Grimani, Antonio Tron seemed to be the main candidate for the dogeship of the Republic, given his wealth, influence over the Council of Ten, and close relationship to the previous Doge. Meanwhile, the death of Pope Leo X had brought much rejoice in the Italian peninsula and was reflected in many celebrations held in Venice. There are the lyrics of Sannazaro, a Neapolitan poet, who showed quite the reluctant attitude the Venetians had, one might say adversarial. And there's a famous few lyrics that said, quote, "Thou didst creep into our midst like a fox, thou didst live amongst us like a lion, and thou hast died like a dog." End of quote. This is in direct reference to Pope Leo X, the Medici Pope. The Venetians were hoping to take advantage of this opportunity and tried to propose Domenico Grimani as a possible choice for the papacy. This would have had great influence over the larger geopolitical situation of the time by forming a committed and solid alliance between the Venetian Republic and the papacy, most likely formed against the emperor. However, the surprising election of Adrian VI prevented that and seemed problematic from a Venetian point of view, mainly because of his very close relationship. He tutored Charles V. This meant that not only would the papacy renew their alliance with the emperor, but it would also be quite committed to it. However, the new pope was a foreigner, non-Italian, and did not seem to have much interest in Italian politics, but rather in reforming the church after Leo X's pontificate. The beginning of Adrian's reign seemed to be riddled with problems not only in Italy but also in the Eastern Mediterranean, where Suleiman the Magnificent was commencing his campaign into Europe. Rhodes was on the brink of a siege in August 1522 by a colossal Ottoman army and navy. This, of course, alarmed the Venetian Republic, who had decided to recall Andrea Gritti to organize the fleet and the army and defend their positions in the proximity of Rhodes. Such were Crete or Candia and Cyprus. These Venetian preparations were mistaken by most Italian princes as Venice getting ready for war in the Italian peninsula, whereas efforts were put into defense in case of an Ottoman attack in the Mediterranean. Pope Adrian VI seemed to adopt a more non-aggressive and neutral stance towards the Venetians and their representatives, who were included in talks held by the papacy to find a solution in aiding the Knights of St. John in Rhodes. There were quite a few plans of action, and the main one was for the Venetian fleet to assist with transportation of French troops to Rhodes, with papal and support from Florence as well. In the end, no plan came to fruition, and the papacy, along with the other princes, failed to deliver help to what was considered an important bastion of Christianity. The Venetian Senate seemed to approve of Adrian's policies and aimed to improve papal-Venetian relations, badly deteriorated in the previous 2 decades. This was reflected by the Venetian decision to join a new confederation with the Pope and Emperor against France, shortly after Rhodes was captured by the Ottomans. However, the political landscape would drastically change once more as the Pope Adrian died in September 1523, which resulted in the election of another Medici Pope, namely Clement VII. Consequently, the Venetians had to be prudent because Clement could not be regarded as a reliable ally. The same argument can be made with Charles, whose conflict with Clement would prove to have a dramatic impact not just on Rome, but also the Italian peninsula. 1523 demonstrated to be such an important year. So in 1523, after the death of Doge Grimani, Antonio Tron seemed to me the main candidate for the Dogeship of the Republic, given his wealth, influence over the Council of Ten, and close relationship with the previous Doge. Andrea Gritti emerged victorious from the elections due to his vast military experience and took a radically different policy from the previous Doges, as Venetian historian Robert Finlay called him the Fabius Maximus of Venice. As a result, alliances had to be reconsidered despite Gritti's pro-French attitudes, and the new Doge proved to mastermind alliances and treaties which prevented another Agnadello scenario from happening. The Treaty of Worms in 1523 with the Emperor relevantly illustrated his policy because due to the non-arrival of French troops in Milan, Gritti realized that Venice had to be in good terms with the emperor. This treaty also implied a Venetian payment of 200,000 ducats and providing 25 galleys for the defense of Naples. And in return, the Venetian Republic would keep its possessions in the terraferma. The key aspect of this treaty, however, would prove to be the choice of guarantors, as the Signoria had appointed Henry VIII, Ludovico Sforza, and the Pope. This reflected the Venetian desire to reinstate the Sforzas into Milan and have the papacy as an ally. Basically, Venice, under Andrea Gritti, aimed to maintain a balance of power in Italy and limit the influence of the emperor as much as possible. Gritti tried to simultaneously maintain an alliance with the French, and the Doge justified to the King of France that Venice meant no disrespect and no aggression towards France, but had no choice but to reach an agreement with the emperor in order to prevent another eventual invasion by imperial forces. The result of the 1525 Battle of Pavia could be seen from two perspectives. From Pope Clement's point of view, it was a disaster because he had relied on Francis to expel Charles from Italy in return for recognition of Naples towards the French. From a Venetian perspective, this was another step in Gritti's neutral and combat-avoiding tactic, as no Venetian troops were present at Pavia. Francesco Guicciardini had blamed the Pope of avarice and pusillanimity for failing to deliver support to Francis. Indeed, he still supported the French king through his intervention in the Peace of Madrid from 1526, where Clement VII was made guarantor. And the genesis of the League of Cognac once again reunited Venetian and papal interests. This was a complicated situation because Pope Clement VII resented the Venetians but knew that he would need their help against the emperor. The Doge and Council of Ten realized that imperial power in Italy was gradually becoming more and more present and powerful, especially after the 1526 Treaty of Madrid, and as a result, joined the league with the French and the papacy. Venice had supported most of the costs of the Cognac League with no results, leading for the Republic to once more reconsider its options. Venetian non-intervention in the sack of Rome in 1527 was seen as a crucial and critical moment, which in a way confirmed Habsburg triumph over Italy. There were several factors that should be taken into account for explaining the lack of response for the Venetians in this incident. First of all, Andrea Gritti wanted to avoid another disastrous defeat, which, given the size of Charles's forces, a large Spanish imperial army, was a possibility. Second of all, the army of the Holy League was under the command of Francesco della Rovere, captain general of the Venetian army, who was expelled from Urbino by Pope Leo X, and as a result had reasons of personal nature to not help the papacy, who was under another rule of a Medici. Della Rovere defended himself by arguing that he had obeyed orders from the Signoria and it was not his decision whether or not to offer assistance. Gritti's Fabian policy had maintained the integrity, the territorial integrity, that is, of the Venetian Republic, at the cost of the devastation of Rome and the subsequent imprisonment of Pope Clement VII. However, after the liberation of Pope Clement VII, the situation became increasingly problematic for the Venetian Republic and Andrea Gritti because of a new papal imperial alliance confirmed through the 1529 Treaty of Barcelona. This was a defensive pact which would have given imperial troops safe passage towards Naples, with the papacy demanding the restoration of Cervia, Ravenna and Modena to the Holy See as recompense for this peace and as compensation for the events from 1527. Andrea Gritti and the Senate tried to gain French support in this situation, passing an almost unanimous vote to send informative letters regarding this Venetian papal clash to the French king. Afterwards, in a letter to the Republic's ambassador in England and to Henry VIII, the Doge and the Senate justified their claim over the territories of Romagna and Bologna by arguing that Venice defended them against the imperial army and as a result have devoted financial resources worth 2.5 million ducats overall in the interest of the papacy. It seemed as if everyone was against Venice in the matter of Ravenna and Cervia, their restoration. France was inclined to ask the Venetians to restore these cities to the papacy and for the Duke of Ferrara to do likewise with Modena. However, Louis of Savoy postponed an official act out of fear of driving both Venice and Ferrara into an alliance with the emperor. England was more direct, and through Cardinal Wolsey, the English advised on the immediate restoration. In Rome, ardent supporters of the papacy, such as the Bishop of Pistoia, argued that Venice had brought Rome to ruin through the annexation of these cities, which deprived Rome and the papacy of tax revenue, and by allowing the imperialists to plunder the city of Rome in 1527. The Pope began to orchestrate secret meetings, as Gasparo Contarini, Venetian ambassador in Rome, reported back to the Signoria that he had found Clement in a conference room with the ambassadors from France, Milan, and England. Contarini tried to create a diversion by advising the English ambassador to not press on this matter, as it would have created a dangerous precedent in Italy, arguing that Ferrara and Florence also had possessions wanted by the papacy, which added to the strong imperial presence in Lombardy, and it could have extended the continuation of war in the region, a scenario desired by nobody. In reality and truth, this was no more than a bluff, as Florence was soon to be restored once more to the Medici family with the help of the imperials. A commission was formed by Andrea Gritti and the Venetian Senate, which made a very unusual proposition that reflected the level of distrust between the Venetian Republic and the papacy. The plan would have involved the placement of Ravenna and Cervia under temporary jurisdiction of France and England until the war was over in Lombardy, leaving matters to be decided once peace had been achieved. Prior to this proposal, which unsurprisingly was not accepted by anyone, Doge Andrea Gritti argued that Clement was driven by his personal Medician ambition in this dispute, and argued that Adrian VI, the previous pope, had he still been alive, would have not pressed on with this issue. The response of Pope Clement VII to these Venetian accusations was aggressive, showing clear intentions of his unwillingness to compromise on the matter. As a result, in order to avoid another diplomatic isolation similar to the one prior to the League of Cambrai, the Venetians, Venice, accepted the terms in the treaty signed at Bologna, done through papal mediation, and finally recognized the long and problematic restoration of Ravenna and Cervia to Rome. This way, Gritti, the Senate, the Venetian government avoided a situation which had preceded the War of the League of Cambrai. Ironically, by 1530, peace was finally achieved through papal-Venetian cooperation with considerable amount of Venetian compromise. Andrea Gritti's policies had paid off, having learned from the mistakes of his predecessors, and the Fabian strategy not only preserved the most important possessions of Venice, but also allowed for a future alliance of the emperor against an ever-increasing enemy towards the east, namely the Ottomans and the Mediterranean policy of Suleiman the Magnificent. In regards to Ottoman-Venetian relations, we've spoken about Andrea Gritti and his role in the peace and treaty from 1503, which concluded the Second Ottoman-Venetian War. The Venetians had lost, Ottomans emerged victorious. There was always a question whether there was a tacit alliance between the Republic of Venice and the Ottoman Sultan. We see that throughout the century, questions about the Venetian non-intervention at Malta much later on. But the conflicts that followed until 1530 showed an unusual, one might say suspicious, cooperation between the two sides. For example, in 1510, both England and Scotland were interested in launching a crusade against the Ottomans, and the English king tried to make efforts to pacify the Venetians and the papacy in order to form an alliance against the Ottomans. The Scottish king made the tempting proposition of becoming the Signoria's captain general and provide an army of around 10,000 soldiers and a large fleet to be used under pilgrimage pretenses. And the King of England tried to persuade Maximilian to end their conflict, as the conflicts between the infidels, between quotes, represented the perfect opportunity to strike in 1512. Nothing ever came to this, and peace between the Venetians and the Ottomans would be renewed, an important moment being in 1518. However, in 1518, Venetians wanted this pact to be secret, as they did not wish for other Christian princes, mainly the papacy, to keep suspecting them of having this tacit alliance with the Ottomans. And the report sent to the Republic's ambassador in London specifically asked to not mention this peace. And 1518 was a critical year concerning the Ottoman expansion, as the Mamluks have been defeated by Selim I, and the kingdom was annexed. Prior to this, the Venetians had excellent relations with the Mamluk Sultanate. There is, of course, the issue of Cyprus and the claims Selim II would have later on. The Venetians had to remain neutral in the conflict between the Ottomans and the Mamluks, much like the King of Tunis and the princes of the Barbary states did, because the Republic of Venice knew that an eventual Mamluk conquest would not have changed trading relations with the economic centers of Cairo and Alexandria. They would just change hands, and it would be under Ottoman rule, which the Venetians always had trading relations via Constantinople and other places of the Ottoman Empire. So it is interesting to look at Venetian reactions to the main Ottoman conquests in the 1520s, namely the Siege of Rhodes. We've talked a bit about that. Then the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, pivotal moment in Central/Eastern European history, and the Siege of Vienna in 1529. Most of these events coming once Andrea Gritti became Doge. So the death of Sultan Selim I brought much relief to Christian princes, including to the Venetians, reflected in Paolo Giovio's statement, who said, quote, "All men agreed that a gentle lamb had succeeded a fierce lion, since Suleiman himself was but young and of no experience," end of quote. I would say that in hindsight, in retrospect, this couldn't be further from the truth, given the rate of success and the very few defeats Suleiman experienced over many decades until the mid-1560s. The Venetians received encouraging signs from Constantinople, as in the first year of his reign, Suleiman passed a firman, which was a official document which reconfirmed trading rights for Venetian merchants. In 1521, the Ottomans conquer Belgrade. In 1522, we see what happens at Rhodes. There wasn't much the Venetians could do to prevent the conquest of Rhodes, apart from calling a truce between the Christian powers, as they could not face a fleet of 300 ships and an army of over 100,000. Andrea Gritti's election in 1523, going back a bit, represented an advantage for the Republic because, as mentioned before, he had much experience in the Ottoman Empire. He spoke the language, and he was very well acquainted with Ottoman practices. And as a result, the Venetians, partially because of Andrea Gritti, maintained a good relationship with the Sultan. And there was a mutual cooperation pact in 1524 in fighting Mediterranean piracy. In 1526, the Venetians did not reply to King Louis II of Hungary's request for a united effort against the Ottomans at Mohacs, proof being that Venetian armies were ordered to stay at their usual quarters. It is worth considering that at the time, Venice began to be involved in the affairs of the League of Cognac, and it can be argued that they had few resources to spare. But the Ottoman victory against the Hungarians caused serious concerns for Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, as the Turks would approach the borders of the empire and would seek to target Vienna, which they did in 1529. Cardinal Wolsey had accused the Venetians of concluding an alliance with the Sultan in the detriment of the emperor. The Venetians regarded these accusations as absurd, arguing that in the past the Republic had helped the Hungarian kingdom financially, and it was Venetian tradition to maintain diplomatic relationships between the Porte in Constantinople and the Signoria of Venice. The Venetians argued that this was for the protection of Venetian subjects and merchants from the Ottoman Empire. Declaring war against the Ottomans at Mohacs would have had catastrophic consequences for Venetian economics, the economy of the Republic, but also for the diplomatic ties between the Ottoman Empire and the Venetians. One can ask why the Venetians did not help the Hungarians when they needed all the assistance they could get. The financial aspect is relevant, and but it's also worth taking a look at the bigger picture. Another critical moment is the 1529 Ottoman siege of Vienna. By 1529, imperial influence in Italy was at its peak, with only the restoration of the Medici family in Florence being required for the imperial coronation to finally take place. It did take place in 1530 at Bologna. In September, Sultan Suleiman had launched an unprecedented attack on the Habsburg capital. The siege was a failure due to the great defensive organization under Ferdinand, but also weather conditions and the late departure from Constantinople played crucial roles in the Ottoman failure to take Vienna. Moving a bit further in time, after the coronation of Bologna, the Venetian Republic seemed inclined to strengthen its relations with the emperor. However, they kept close contact with officials from Constantinople and monitored the situation. In January 1532, Luigi Gritti, son of Doge Andrea Gritti, informed Clement VII of Ottoman preparations for an Italian invasion. By this point, the Ottomans were in good terms with the Persians, which allowed them to focus once more on European campaigns. The Venetians were alarmed by the fact that Ibrahim Pasha had prepared a large fleet with help from the Corsairs and the Persians, which had an unknown destination. However, there was certainty that the fleet would pass through the Channel of Corfu. This Venetian possession of Corfu was always wanted by the Ottomans due to its strategic positions, and they knew that should the Sultan want to conquer Corfu, it would have been immensely difficult to resist the siege without help. Consequently, their best option was to receive help from Andrea Doria and his Genoese fleet, which, as we've spoken about in the episodes about Charles V, had much control. In the end, in the year 1532, there were no conflicts that arose, as the Doge Gritti received information that the Sultan had abandoned his expedition against the German lands of the Holy Roman Empire, despite the fact that the Venetians had informed the Sultan that Charles had left Vienna for Spain in October 1532. Meanwhile, the commercial treaty signed in 1535 between the French and the Ottomans complicated the situation for the Venetians and for Doge Gritti. In 1536, after the Spanish had previously defeated Barbarossa at Tunis, in 1535, the Republic's government was aware that an attack from the Ottomans would be imminent. As a result, took precautions by raising the number of ships at sea from 27 to 60 and reinforcing settlements in Candia, Corfu, Zante, and Dubrovnik. The Venetian Republic and Gritti found themselves at a dangerous crossroads. The situation was even more complicated because decisions had to be made in accordance with the Senate, Doge, and the Council of Ten. A clash of interests can be observed in the choices that Venice had to make in 1536. They had two choices. The first one, which was very pro-French and proposed by Doge Gritti, was to join the newly created Franco-Ottoman alliance. The Venetian Senate and the Council of Ten preferred the second, more prudent option of joining a holy league with the papacy and Charles V, because peace in Italy was regarded as vital, and the Ottomans were a more distant threat, but not to several possessions in their commonwealth, it has to be said. This situation perfectly reflects the complications that derived from the way the Venetian Republic was set out. As Francisco Vettori argued that, quote, the Venetians wish to show that their prince cannot determine alliances and peace at his pleasure. This is, of course, it's the checks and balances, an early modern version of it. But as a result, in 1538, Venice enters a holy league against Suleiman with a proposed contribution of covering the costs of a third. Suleiman regarded this as a hostile act towards the Ottomans, and it can be considered a main trigger for the disruption of peace between the Ottomans and the Venetians, which had been going on since 1503. We've spoken at length throughout the podcast. There are quite a few episodes, if you can check the episode list, about the Third Ottoman-Venetian War, 1537 until 1540. The Venetians, of course, lose that. We've got the Battle of Preveza, which is this pivotal moment in the first half of the 16th century. Sort of confirms two spheres of influence. The east of the Mediterranean, heavily influenced by the Ottomans and a bit by the Venetians. The west, we see Sicily, Malta, under threat in the second half of the 16th century. And of course, the Venetians once more lose another war against the Ottomans, and they have to go for a very unfavorable peace. However, it would be in late December 1538 that Andrea Gritti would die at the age of over 82. I think he was 83, and he would be succeeded by Pietro Lando, who was Doge of Venice from 1538 to 1545. Without a doubt, he was one of the most important military diplomatic figures of 16th century Venetian history, of overall Venetian history, I would say, because of the role that he played initially in Constantinople, the peace talks of the Second Ottoman-Venetian War, his contributions at Agnadello and the War of the League of Cambrai, the way he maintained a prudent course of action during the War of the League of Cognac and avoided another problematic war and Venetian involvement against a very powerful emperor. But in the end, he could not avoid going into another war against the Ottomans, and he died in the midst of a losing war once more against the Ottomans. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wanderer's History podcast about Doge Andrea Gritti, Doge of Venice, of course. If you haven't done so already, please make sure to give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and make sure you never miss any new videos and notifications from the podcast. And until the next time, all the best.